How democratic is truth? Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda. We live in an age when people assume that knowledge should be available equally to all. In matters susceptible of judgment by normal common sense, however, everyone knows there are exceptions. Access to a control room for intercontinental missiles is limited by universal consent to a very few. Access to the controls of a passenger airline is limited to those with the necessary knowledge for operating them, and also to those with the proper authorization. If people don't see the disadvantages of making more subtle knowledge universally available, it is only because they are ignorant of the risks involved. In the case of subtle knowledge, the main disadvantage in making it universally available is the harm it might do to one who isn't ready for it or who might even mock it. True, by mocking truth, he might undermine the faith of a few truth seekers. But then, such tests can also be beneficial as a means of strengthening faith. Again true, the clever doubter's misrepresentation of those truths may dissuade a few seekers from following the spiritual path. But if a seeker really is sincere, he will recognize the truth eventually because it resonates with his own being. No, the greatest problem accrues to the shallow doubter himself. To give him an opportunity to affirm his ignorance might only estrange him even more from the truth, delaying the time when he will turn, as all people must eventually, to the light. Thus the scriptures advise not secrecy, but discretion in the sharing of truth. Jesus Christ says in the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 7, "Give not that which is holy unto dogs, neither cast ye your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet, and turn again and rend you." And Sri Krishna says in the 18th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, "Never speak of these truths to one who is without self-control or devotion, who renders no service, who does not care to hear, or who speaks ill of me." Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om.
Good morning, everyone. This morning's topic, how democratic is truth, is a very fun one for me. It was fun for me to think about this week and to reflect on. As Dharmini was reading, that we have this sense, especially in America, the land of democracy, and democracy is a good thing, that all knowledge, all freedoms should be afforded to everyone equally. And on the deepest sense, that's true. And yet the simple example of the intercontinental missiles being open to very few people by universal consent. I love that phrase, by universal consent. We all agree, yes, that some things have to be restricted to the right people, quote unquote. But I was thinking about it in more sort of mundane terms, because the equality of mankind, of humankind, is something I think we feel just deeply in our hearts, that this is a truth. And when there is a category of people that is subjugating another class of people, there's something that just feels inherently wrong about that. That was the basis of the founding of this country and of democracy in general. I experienced this to some extent, the opposite, not the opposite of it, but how things could be different when I lived in India. India has no longer the caste system legally, and there's a lot of fight towards balancing out equality among all Indian citizens, and certainly politically, each one can vote. But still, there is the remnants of that class system of separation between this person and that person. Yogananda said every country has its own misery-making karma, and India's misery-making karma, he said, is the caste system. this sense of separation. He mentioned America's misery-making karma is, can you guess? It's amazing how that rolls right off the tongue. Materialism, exactly. So, in India, even though we, all men and women and children were equal now, still you could feel that, well, we don't speak to the guard or the gardener or the secretary the same way that we speak to the boss or our nearest and dearest. There's a difference in education, there's a difference in background. It can always be justified. And we ourselves had to some extent, move along in that way. We had experiences of Americans who were, in some particular cases, responding to taxi drivers the same way they would to anyone else. And in the beginning, it's all friendly, but after a while, in a few cases, the taxi drivers, misunderstanding the intentions, in particular, of a few young American women, started thinking, well, maybe something else is going on here, which, it was a difference in culture. But just to say that there was some need to relate to the culture in its own terms, regardless of what we thought about it. But still, it hurt the heart. And when I came back to America, I just felt relaxed in terms of, there's the guy driving the trash truck, and I don't think of him any differently. I don't speak to him any differently than I would speak to anyone else. So that's America's special grace, but it has this concept of knowledge should be equally available to all. Of course, education, basic education, advanced education should be available equally to all, so all can have the same opportunities and so on. But I was thinking of sort of more practical, specific things, like we don't always want knowledge to be available to us. I mean, we could imagine sitting at a movie and you could turn to the person and saying, in the spirit of full disclosure, I just want to let you know he actually lives at the end. We don't want to know that at the beginning of the movie. We want to enjoy the process. It's only meaningful to us at the end of the story. And the reading points out that the danger of revealing knowledge just indiscriminately is the danger it does to, in this case, the doubter himself. And I tried to think about that on a more mundane level. And in the expanded reading on this topic, Swami Kriyananda mentions that we want to share truths with others who are receptive to them, not inflict these truths on them. And I thought, now inflicting knowledge on people, I had that experience when I was a math teacher. Because it was time to learn math, and a lot of times, especially with new students or a new class, it was just like, oh. And I thought about that, because I loved math, and not at first, though. I grew to love math when I was younger. And I noticed that it was a sore spot for many people. You wouldn't necessarily, speaking in terms of not revealing truths indiscriminately, I don't want to mix up my stories, but I am a little bit. You wouldn't go up to a fifth grader, fine, and say, let's talk about calculus. Say, well, the child has a right to know calculus. You don't want to bar the child from learning calculus. Where is your sense of respect and freedom and equality? The child is not, it's not that the child isn't worthy of calculus, it's the child isn't ready for calculus. And similarly, I was saying a fifth grader, but I've had the same experience with some adults, where I've said, well, by the way, I know calculus seems like a weird thing, but it really, never mind. Don't even bother telling me. I remember when I came to the Ananda Palo Alto community, Brian McSweeney, who many of you know, was in 7th grade. And at one point in the first week of my teaching him, he kind of leaned back and said, so, why is 10 to the 0 equal to 1? And so I explained it to him in a few different ways, and he said, okay, makes sense. Then he went home and told his dad that his teacher answered a question that hadn't been answered in the book, and so this teacher might be okay. And the word got to Asha Praver, who is the head of the community, and she came to me and said, "So I heard that Brian had a question, and you answered it well, and he was impressed. This is good." And it was some esoteric question. I said, "Look, it's just 10 to the 0 equals 1, and it's just." She said, "Don't even bother." Now, many adults, I find, have that aversion to math, and that I worked with many students, not just the brilliant mathematical ones, but all students, and I found that math was a sore spot. It was an emotional problem even for many of them. I myself had lots of trouble with math when I was younger, and it was very frustrating. And why? Because I couldn't understand it. And then I was asked to demonstrate my lack of understanding on these tests, and then I got all these things wrong. And then that isn't bad enough. Then you see the kid next to you who got them all right, and then it's like, wow, they understand it, I don't understand it, I'm dumb. That's it. It complicates matters when you're in a big class, a room of 30 people, and by necessity, the teacher really only has time to explain it maybe one way. And if you get that way, great. And if you don't, then it's really hard. I remember a friend of mine who was a genius at mathematics, and he talked about he had a teacher who was explaining things in such a bizarre way, it was very difficult, and that no one in the class understood him. And I said, that's right, I asked him, when did you first know that you were really good at math? And he said, well, we had this teacher, and he explained these things, and nobody understood them. And I didn't understand it. But they all failed, and I got an A. And so I knew, he said, that something must be in there working. And similarly, I found as a teacher it was very difficult to explain algebra. I explained it the way I thought, which was more sort of symbolically and logically, and it just kind of makes sense. If this is true, then that's true, then that's true. And I would just sometimes get staring back at me. So I had to think of, okay, listen, this person is a visual learner, and I am not. And it's painful for me to have to think in visual ways because, everything I draw ends up either being a circle or a square. I mean, it's like I'm very impeded artistically. And yet, it was my obligation to help the student understand. It didn't matter that I understood how to multiply fractions. Congratulations. It was to help this person understand how to multiply fractions. And I found, usually through tutoring, one-on-one, where I could get to know, the student's way of learning, that in time I could convey these things. I remember a student who was she was in 7th grade and she was still in the 6th grade textbook, because everybody worked through the textbooks in their own, at their own pace in our school. And so she hadn't been able to finish it even over the summer, so we had to continue during the school year to finish it. And it was like, look, you've got 2 chapters left, let's get rid of it so you can then be on grade level. And she was a difficult student, and it's partly because just of, her background and so on, but we finally finished the last page, and she was even a little hostile at different times, and I just kind of, as Dharmini was saying last week, thick skin, soft heart, just like, okay, look, let's just get this over with. So when we finally finished the last test on the last chapter and the whole thing, and she scored it, good, you did well, you passed, let's go on. Now, let's bring out the 7th grade book. And I looked at her, and she was looking at the 6th grade book. And she said, I never thought I would finish that book. And that was a turning point for her. She gained in more confidence in overcoming this insurmountable task. And so that's why we have to be careful in sharing spiritual knowledge with people, not according again to their worthiness, but to their readiness. The simple example is if somebody is hostile and you say, I meditate, and they, what do you do that for? And you go into great detail about it, they may just say, well, now I know how stupid it is. And then when later on, when they're really stressed and someone says, maybe you should meditate, oh no, I know all about that stuff. I'm not interested. Actually, that happened in a way to me when I came to my first Ananda event. Well, yeah, I think it was my first Ananda event. Second Ananda event. And I brought a friend. And it was just this wonderful satsang and reading from Autobiography of a Yogi, and I loved it. And I met all these people who seemed like old friends, and I was thrilled. And at the end of it, I just said to my friend who I had brought, isn't this amazing? And he said, yeah. And I said, look, I mean, we were in college, and I was thinking, we've been like staying up till 3 a.m. thinking about the meaning of life and debating it and so on, and now we found it. And he said, yeah, you know, I grew up with religion, and I know that people seem nice, but they aren't really, and it's all fake. And he said, maybe you have to learn that on your own, but go ahead. And so, again, this sense of community and then this bad experience with it had closed him. Now, as it says, that's also, tests do come to the sincere seeker, and we do, overcome them in time and realize perhaps the error was ours or the limitations of human expressions of divine truths and all these things. But Swami Kriyananda points out in the reading commentary, the expanded commentary, that when Jesus said, cast not your pearls before swine, he was saying, obviously, he must have been saying it with a sense of humor. Because if he really meant it in a damning, judgmental way, it would be completely opposed to all of the rest of his message, which was all-embracing and all-loving and all these things. And so he had to be saying it with a bit of a smile even. And saying, why? Why not cast your pearls before swine? Because what do? They trample them. And is that, do they break the pearls? No. And hopefully you have more pearls in your pocket. But it's like, what's the point of giving pearls to swine who are just going to stamp them into the ground? They have no use for them. Now, the Gita, though, it spells it out extremely clearly. It says, speak not of these truths to those who lack self-control, who lack devotion, who render no service, who don't care to hear, or who speak ill of me. Now, at first it sounds like a catalog of mistakes, and in a way it is. But really, if somebody renders no service or speaks ill of the Lord, that's not a permanent state. We can change our minds and decide now we do want to serve, now we do want to speak well of the Lord, now we do have devotion and so on. And so this verse actually outlines the qualifications for spiritual learning by stating them as disqualifications. In other words, it says, speak not of these truths to those who are lacking in self-control. So we know, okay, an early step on the spiritual path is how to develop our self-control. And an easy way to do that, of course, is meditation. Because in meditation we reverse the energy that is normally going out towards the senses to come back in to our inner being and ultimately the spine. And then it's easy for us to control that energy, and it's easy for us to not get as excited by the wrong things and to feel more deeply. Swami Kriyananda said, too much lack of self-control just makes us perpetually restless. And I'm sure we've all had those experiences. I certainly did growing up, just constantly restless. And then if I was in too calm of an environment, it was difficult for me. My mom said to me when I was 5, okay, that's it, go to your room. And I would say, with pleasure. And I would go to my room and she'd close the door and I would be totally enthused because I would be tinkering away and playing with. So this didn't last very long. As she figured out, she opened, okay, you can come out now. Oh, I'm perfectly happy. So then she came up with the punishment chair. And in the punishment chair, you had to sit and not speak and not move. Boy, did this almost kill me. Just like, I mean, just that was torture because of the level of restlessness. I couldn't. By contrast, I remember a young student when I was an young school teacher, and there was a younger student playing in the grass all by herself, and the rest of the kids were all doing something, and she was just sort of laying on the grass, and I thought, oh, she's forlorn, separated from the herd, and feeling so miserable, and I said, Shruti, are you okay? And she said, yeah. And she was looking at this tiny little ladybug, crawling on a blade of grass, just for minutes and minutes and minutes. She was deeply enjoying herself and that stillness. And I, oh, okay. So, the next thing he mentions is those who are lacking in devotion. So again, putting it into the positive. Devotion is another requirement on the spiritual path. And I'm sure each one of us has experienced a growing of devotion in our hearts. That the more we practice these things, the more our hearts are open. And devotion is necessary. As Sri Yukteswar said, Kriya Yoga plus devotion is spiritual mathematics. It cannot fail to produce self-realization. And Swami Kriyananda added, you need technique and devotion. With technique and no devotion, you can't get there. And with no technique and devotion, you can get there. Because if we love God enough, He will just come to us. And each sort of tendril of love we send towards Him, He comes racing towards us. And I'm sure we've all experienced that. Devotion almost snowballs in a way. The more we pour out to God, the more He comes. But devotion has to be cultivated inwardly. Devotion is the one thing we can't teach people. We can't teach someone to be devotional. We can only create circumstances or try to inspire, but it has to come from within. There was a disciple of Yogananda's who said, Master, bless me with devotion. And Yogananda said, you are saying, give me money so I can go and buy something in the store. He said, I say you must first earn the money. You must first develop your own devotion, and then you can have these experiences of God that you're looking for. The next one, those who render no service. Well, so therefore we need to serve. And why? Because partly, pragmatically, when we serve, we forget ourselves. It's that simple. And when we serve, we, of course, help others, we share with others, but it's the easiest way to get out of all of the stuff that goes on in our minds. And so, welcome. So, and why would we not serve? I know the concept of service was foreign to me at first, like you should serve. It was like, why? And it's, I'm rather fascinated with all the things that I'm doing that relate to me. And it was only when I realized all these other people were serving and that I was the beneficiary of that, and then I obviously wanted to, I'll help you move the chairs or whatever. I just felt great. And so it's, in a way, it's very selfish to selflessly serve because it's gratifying. But it's gratifying to the soul, not to the ego. And then the next one he mentions is those who do not care to hear. And I already kind of mentioned that. But another story illustrating that is when Swami was speaking to an atheist, and the atheist was saying there can't be any God, and Swami started giving him more and more examples that there was a God, and finally ended with a few miracles he had experienced. And I don't know if I'm breaking the rules, but one of the miracles, because I know many of you have heard Swami Kriyananda tell this story, one of the miracles he mentioned was that he had been at the dentist as a young disciple, and the pain had been so intense that he prayed to Master Yogananda, and the pain vanished. And so this was one of his proofs that he offered to this atheistical person. And he got nowhere with the person, just convinced the person more of his own mental frailty. And so Yogananda said to him, by the way, when you're with atheistical people, don't talk about miracles. It's just not appropriate. And I had a cousin like that who asked me, so what are you reading in the autobiography of a yogi? And so I read this current page, the current story I was on. And he said, well, that's not a miracle. That can easily be explained by the disturbance. Ha! And actually it did shake me a little bit, because I thought, well, I guess, because my faith was still young. I hadn't developed my faith to the point of saying, well, listen, I have faith in the author of this book that it has to be true. And even if you can explain it away logistically, that's just the mechanism of the miracle. In truth, there is no such thing as a miracle, or else everything is a miracle. I mean, the fact that we can turn on this screen and see someone as a live broadcast around the world, that's a miracle to me still. And if you went back 50 years ago, it would be a miracle to everyone that such a thing could be possible. And so when we can do interplanetary travel, or when we can dissolve these bodies, as Sri Yukteswar did in Autobiography of a Yogi, and then reconstruct them, it won't be miraculous if we can explain the mechanism, and if we can do it. So, the last one he says is, don't speak of these truths to those who speak ill of me, meaning of God. And we might ask, well, I mean, if someone speaks ill of God, they might not even be interested in hearing these truths. They wouldn't have to start really like, God, never mind. Okay. But Swami goes into it a little more deeply. He said sometimes people are disrespectful to God by cheapening the teachings, by saying, yeah, it's good if you want to just, reduce your stress or something, or it's good if you just kind of want to chill out, but that's about all it's good for. In other words, not realizing the great power of what they have. That's why, one of the reasons why Kriya Yoga, Yogananda said, takes such a preparation before the initiation. We need to prepare our receptivity. We have to build up our stamina in terms of being able to meditate an hour and a half a day and so on. But also, we need to really, I don't know how to express it, but we need to be able to receive fully the grace of this God-given technique into our hearts. It's not that it takes that long to master the technical aspects of the technique. It's that it takes that long for us to be fully open and trusting and receptive. Because the technique doesn't work, it's not a breathing exercise that, okay, just breathe this way and you go straight to God. It's like picking yourself up by your shoelaces and doesn't happen that way. We have to ask Yogananda to grasp us, not by the shoelaces, but by the hand. And so he said that explicitly, through your Kriya practice, I will awaken you. And that's how true awakening comes. It is a transference from one God-enlightened person to another. So, just on a simple level, we have to think about this aspect of, is the person I'm speaking to ready to hear this? For example, we may know that someone has a particular problem, and we may be able to see it quite clearly because of that curse that affects humanity, that allows us all to see the other person's defects very clearly, but not necessarily our own as easily. And so, but is it helpful to say, well, just to tell you, your problem is that you're this way. And if you think that is useful, just try it. And, when you find all your friends scurrying or turning around going, oh yeah? Your problem is. So, we realize that it has to be the right time and the right place. And we have to be speaking with the right motive. Am I saying this because of this person's need to hear it or my need to say it? Swami Kriyananda has said he has waited sometimes 10 years before offering a particular piece of advice to a person. Because too soon, and it not only bounces off, but then when you bring it up some years later, they say, oh yeah, I already heard that. And there's still that negative reaction. So, let us be discreet, but is one way, but thoughtful, aware of who we're speaking to, what we're sharing with them. Because above all, people want friendship, people want kindness, and let's be beacons of kindness and friendship to all. I wanted to close with this reading from Whispers from Eternity. This is the prayer demand for illumination. O Spirit, beloved Father, Oversoul of the universe, Spirit of spirits, friend of friends, teach me the mystery of my existence. Teach me to worship Thee in breathlessness and in deathlessness. In the fire of devotion, burn away my ignorance. In the stillness of my soul, come, Spirit, come. Possess me and teach me to feel Thy immortal presence in and around me. Come, Spirit, come. Come, Spirit, come.